Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Jordan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen. All of these countries have two things in common. First, they are very poor, and second, they are all practicing Islam. Whichever Muslim country we take, other than the oil-rich Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, their main difference from the developed European countries is their extreme poverty. And if we compare their GDP, on average, Muslim countries are 5,000 behind the average. This topic has been relevant for centuries. Many authors have written books and research papers on this topic, but most often society turns to two theories. The first theory states that the poverty of Muslim countries is due to their poor location, as these territories are dominated by mountainous areas and deserts. In addition, the climate is hot and arid, which hits agriculture hard. But we have perfect examples of economically developed and strong countries, such as South Korea, Singapore, Norway, where agriculture is either very difficult or not possible at all. The second theory is related to the colonial past, and this theory also has a place because the former empires did not care about their colonies, but on the contrary tried to siphon off every last drop from the country. This was usually accompanied by a very cruel attitude to the local population, and often when all the local tribes simply died out. Of course, you could say that there are examples of other former colonies with other religions, such as India, whose economies were severely crippled and slowed down by the colonial past, and no doubt the same slowdown happened to Muslim colonies, but that is a consequence, not a cause of the poverty of these countries. Colonies were usually either ancient tribes or weak and undeveloped states, and if we look at the world GDP level, Muslim countries accounted for about 10% of the total GDP in the 10th and 15th centuries, while Europe was swallowed up by the Dark Ages. Also, the most populated city on the planet at that time was Baghdad, with about 1 million people, and it was also a Muslim city. By the way, in Constantinople at the same time lived from 300 to 500,000 people, and it was considered the largest Christian city. Exactly Muslims in this time interval have made the most part of scientific discoveries in algebra, chemistry, physics, medicine, and other sciences. Muslim countries had better trade than any European kingdom, and Arabic was as popular as English is now. As you can see, even though these countries were dominated by Islam, they were some of the most prosperous. Apparently, Islam was not such a problem at this time. But then, what was the problem? You see, by the 18th century, the world GDP level of Muslim countries had dropped drastically from 10% to 2%. This only tells us one thing: these countries had become impoverished long before they were colonized. But what might have happened in the meantime? Where and how did Europe bypass Muslim countries? Is Islam to blame for this? And does it explain all the situations that were committed 500 years ago? At the time of Muslim domination, all knowledge was mainly passed on by word of mouth, as there were books, but there were not many of them, and not everyone could afford them. But time passed, and in about 1440 in the town of Mainz, Germany, Johannes Gutenberg invented the very first printing press. After that, the book printing boom begins. In 1458, the press appeared in Strasbourg, in France. In 1464, in Subiaco, and another one in Rome just 3 years later. In 1468, the press appeared in Basel, in Switzerland. And so by the end of the 15th century, every European country had its own printing press, and the level of education jumped to unprecedented heights as books became cheap and accessible to the poor strata of the population. And what happens? The level of education in European countries rises from 10% to an average of 40%. But at the same time, in Muslim countries, the average percentage of education is 2%. But why is this so? Did the Muslim countries not have enough money for printing presses? It was something else. Europe needed innovation, and so they welcomed Gutenberg's new printing press with open arms. Even though it meant job losses, since all books used to be copied by hand, the previously respected scribes were no longer needed. Of course, this led to riots, but everyone saw far more use for a smart and handy machine than for labor. By comparison, in 1450, there were about 30,000 manuscript books in Europe at one time. And by 1500, just 50 years later, Gutenberg's machines had printed, according to various estimates, between 12 million and 20 million books. That's 666,000% more than in all previous eras. But why didn't the Muslims, even though they saw the success of the Europeans, follow their example? In 1480, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire imposes a ban on the use of printing presses. Of course, at first this was explained by the fact that it violated the laws of the Quran on the printing of religious texts. But among other things, it was due to the conservatism of Muslim countries of those times, as well as the fact that they were afraid of losing control of power. After all, an educated population is much more difficult to control, which was in nobody's interest. As a result, when in Europe even women had access to books, and in Scandinavian countries the level of education reached as much as 90%, the Ottoman Empire only introduced the first printing press in 1727, but with restrictions on the printing of religious text. And without restrictions, the first printing press appeared in Egypt only in 1798 during the French occupation. Due to the growth of education, European states made many new discoveries in science, invented new technologies, conducted trade more competently, started industrial revolution and many other benefits of knowledge, because of which the economy of European countries began to grow rapidly. But it was not that Muslims became poorer. No, they just didn't get richer. On top of that came the Islamic restrictions on women's rights. Roughly speaking, you can divide the population into two parts. As in those days, women were not allowed to work or study. She was only the keeper of the home. At the same time, in countries like England and Scotland, the percentage of educated women was about 30 to 40%. In the Netherlands, already 40 to 50%, and in Sweden, as much as 50 to 60%. Also, who do you think can be educated by a woman who has never read a book, never studied, and never worked? It is unlikely that it will be new outstanding scientists, inventors, or successful rulers of their states. There is also one law in Islam, which in the 10th century did not prevent countries from growing and developing in any way. But with the development of industry and educated population, the Islamic law of inheritance and polygamy became a big obstacle to the growth of economy in Muslim countries. According to this law, all the inheritance of a parent is distributed evenly among all his heirs and his company is sold. As a result, no one wanted to make a big or even medium-sized business, because in any case, after his death, it would be put up for sale. That's why there are so many small businesses in Muslim countries. And as we know, polygamy is allowed in Muslimism. Many wives equals many children. And so each child gets very little of what his parents earned. So while British East India companies had hundreds of people on the board of directors, Muslim companies, even the smaller ones, had a maximum of 2 owners. Whoa, why is that? Back to Islam again. If one of the owners of a company goes, the company is sold because the inheritance has to be distributed. That's what scared away investors. No one wanted to invest in a company that could close down and you would have no effect on it. Besides, if you decided to become a partner in a Muslim company, you would have to accept Islam, and as you know, in those times faith meant a lot. It would seem to be even worse. Businesses are only small, which hardly feed the economy. You are not allowed to use modern inventions and discoveries, and there are no people who are educated enough to use them. But there is another reason that is directly related to the poverty of Muslim countries nowadays. It is the backward financial system. First of all, while all the countries of Europe have already introduced bills of exchange to avoid carrying gold and avoid pirates and robbers. Think about it, why would you rob merchants who only have useless pieces of paper? Muslim countries in general also had bills of exchange, and they appeared even earlier than in Europe. But they were much less effective and were not in demand. Therefore, Muslim ships transported their money in the old-fashioned way, in sacks of gold, and they often encountered pirates. Plus, Islam has a prohibition on charging interest, meaning no one could take out a loan. And how would your economy and companies grow without financial support? Of course, there were many loopholes that even the sultans themselves told. For example, you buy back a carpet that is in demand for 100 coins and sell it for 150, just the buyer will pay you gradually. So it didn't count as interest and you got around the ban. Of course, this did not save the banking system and no credit was popular, which severely hampered the development of the economy and the growth of companies. There was another important problem in Muslim countries, which still impoverishes states today: corruption. This was especially evident in the courts. If a Muslim and a non-Muslim tried each other, the Muslim always won. If two Muslims are judged, the richer one wins. In addition, the Muslim culture has never taken treaties, agreements, and other papers on which the agreements of the parties are fixed seriously. Only in 5% of cases did the court consider the documents attached to the case. Instead, the parties were required to bring in as many people as possible to prove their case. Of course, it was not uncommon for such people to be bribed, and it all came down to the fact that the richest Muslim was right. No European would have wanted to deal with Muslim traitors in such a case, because he would have lost and there was nothing he could do about it. And this attitude also hit the economies of Islamic states hard. There is another not-so-obvious problem. In many Muslim countries, there has been and still is a dictatorship. It is obvious to everyone here that this format of government leads to nothing good. And instead of developing their population, the authorities encourage people to look for any answers to their questions in the Quran. Your wife ran away from you. Read the Quran. You have no money. Look for an answer in the Quran. There is inflation in the country, and price tags on the shelves of the store change every day. You will definitely find the answer in the Quran. Yes, you will not believe it, but even in matters of governing the country and building an economic strategy, turn to the Quran. To understand, the Quran was written in the first half of the 7th century AD, and maybe its rules worked really well back then. Judging by the way Muslim countries lived in the 10th to 15th centuries, the rules of the Quran worked well in those times. But time passed, the world changed, and the rules that were written in the 7th century became obsolete. In the New World, we had to live by new rules, and Muslim countries resisted it, like Gutenberg's printing press. But when they began to see how huge the gap between them and the Europeans was becoming, they were forced to make changes in the rules of the Quran that prevented their countries from growing further.